It is our absolute pleasure to welcome our first Academy Award-winning guest, Mr. Paul Hirsch, who edited a few films that you will know. Carrie, let's see, what else, James?
So he won an Academy Award.
No. Don't say which one.
We'll get to what he won for, but let's talk about what he was nominated for.
Oh, yeah.
Recently. Ray,
yeah.
Ray. So Ray,
Your wife's favorite movie?
Steel Magnolias.
Yes, absolutely.
Steel Magnolias.
Mission Impossible.
And actually Mission Impossible, and he also edited. Why am I blanking on Mission Impossible Ghost Protocol?
Mm-hmm.
And he edited that. We didn't get a chance to talk to him about that, but I believe he edited that, and his daughter, I believe, was part of the team that edited that. She is an editor in her own right.
Right. We didn't get a chance to talk to him about many things. We could have kept him on for 3 or 4 hours, and he assured us he wasn't going to do it. Damn it. He didn't actually say that.
No.
He told us there's 2 anecdotes you're absolutely going to love. One of them's about Anne Bancroft, right?
Yes.
And the other one is about Joel Schumacher, who directed the best Batman movie, Batman and Robin. That's a joke. It is not the best Batman movie, but he did edit a couple of Joel Schumacher films.
So, yeah, some of the movies that he worked on, and we mentioned a couple of them, but I'm just going to ramble through a couple of these. You got Phantom of the Paradise.
Yep. All Depalma films.
You've got Carrie, we mentioned.
Sisters.
I'll skip the big one. The big 2, actually. You've got Depalma. You've got Footloose, because we're going to get loose.
Footloose.
2
of my favorite John Hughes films.
Ferris Bueller's Day Off, Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. We've already mentioned Steel Magnolias. Raising Cain, Falling Down, that's Schumacher.
Joel Schumacher.
Mighty Joe Young, Mission to Mars.
Back to Depalma again.
Yeah. Righteous Kill. Even because it is the holiday season, we should mention Deck the Halls.
Yeah.
And some films that did big international business, and Warcraft, based on World of Warcraft. Duncan Jones, and recently The Mummy.
Yep.
But Joe, do you want to say the big?
Yeah. So he won an Oscar for a little film that you probably never heard about. If you actually were to turn the camera that way, you could see that I have the one sheets for the first 2 in that particular trilogy. I wasn't going to take it down because I have it. And James has seen it. I actually have it in museum glass framed.
Yeah, because it's an Academy Award
winning movie. And he won an Academy Award for this little picture right here. I've got a little bit of a glare. Can you see that there's some sort of wars that take place during the stars?
Some sort of space battles.
Battles. Yeah, Star Wars. This is one of the chroma arts from 1994 I've had on my wall. I have this one. And I have the one from Empire Strikes Back, which he also did what, James?
He edited.
He edited him.
So our guest is
Paul Hirsch, who has written his autobiography right here. Actually, I picked up the wrong book. I actually have it right here. He says, a long time ago in a galaxy, in a cutting room far, far away. Mr. Paul Hirsch is on our episode. I've known about this. We got this booked. Well, he agreed to do it back in June, but he wanted to wait a while, and I couldn't announce it, and it was killing me because I was like, we're going to have an Academy Award winning, blah, 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 blah. But I couldn't tell everybody in case something fell through. I didn't want to look stupid. But he spent a little over an hour with us. He was very charming, extremely gracious with his time. And there is this book, which you can get on Amazon, which you can get from his website, which you can get at your local bookstore. Check it out. I've started reading it. I'm about a third way through. Some of the stories are great. And if you're a fan of horror, we've got Carrie. If you're a fan of Depalma, we got Carrie. If you're a fan of science fiction, we have Star Wars and how that happened, and his times with Lucas, his falling out with Depalma, how they reconcile.
And really quick, if there is another book not written by him, and read his book first, but there's another book that actually focuses on one of the reasons Star Wars became a classic is the editing.
Yeah.
And so you get that story. And like I said, there's an entire book dedicated to just that process. Read his book instead.
Yeah.
And real quick, we mentioned a couple of the ones, the other movies that he worked on that, speaking of horror, World War Z, he was an uncredited additional editor for that. The Great Gatsby, if you're a fan of classic
literature. That was a horrible horror film.
Yeah, it was. And again, and more recently as well, Disney's The Nutcracker and the Four Realms film, he was an additional editor.
Yeah.
So still very much active. So you're not going to get, you're going to get the gestalt, really, of films that impacted, if you grew up in the 80s or 90s or even today.
Or the 70s, yeah.
Yeah.
He's influenced cinema for the last 40 years. Really quick, I want to say, go out, buy his book. Buy his book. It's a fascinating, really well-written book. I couldn't compliment him enough, and I know at the first of it you're going to hear was like, why is Joe kissing his ass? Because this sounds like an insult, but I have read other books written by filmmakers, editors, and this one's really well-written. Go ahead.
One thing I do want to say as well is that, when you're thinking about looking for his book, another thing we should say, and he mentions this a little bit at the end, see if he's appearing near you. See if you can get this book signed.
Yeah, he's doing a lot of appearances. He was just at Chicago. He did a live Q&A after Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. He said he talks about it in our interview.
Yeah, watch the interview. And then buy the book.
Yeah, buy the book. And then subscribe to Bonehead Weekly. We'd like that. And share us. Buy the book. Buy the ticket. Take the ride. Really quick, I got to apologize for two things on this. One of them, Mr. Hirsch looks great. We look like crap if you're watching it on the YouTube version because we had some issues with Skype, and that's not Mr. Hirsch's fault. That's our fault. We usually use Zoom, so you can only see Chad in it. It's weird. The other thing,
but if you're a big Chad fan,
this is the episode. If you love editing and Chad and Paul Hirsch, this is the best episode to watch on YouTube.
You don't see me, I believe, at all. You'll hear me.
I think you see half my head at sometimes,
and that's our fault. Great episode for Chad fans.
For our folks listening to it, the audio on our side is a little wonky because, for some odd reason, the Blue Yeti wasn't working with Skype. It's a long story. However, we have our first Academy Award winner, Mr. Paul Hirsch. Thank him so much. We're going to tag him in it. Subscribe to Bonehead. Check this out and let us know. And don't forget to go out and buy his book for all your filmmaking friends this holiday season. Thank you so much for being on Bonehead Weekly.
You forgot the most important part of Kentucky.
What?
99% of the world's disco balls are made right here.
It's a weird fact.
That's. I don't know if we need to be proud of that.
I don't even know that we needed to tell him that. So
I love the nightlife. I love to boogie.
So moving right along in our show, welcome so much.
Which one is Chad?
This is Chad. I am Joe, and that is James. And we've been doing a lot of what we do is this show. We both all work in higher education. Chad and I work at the University of Kentucky. James is a full-time faculty at the University of
Southern Mississippi.
So we work in higher ed, and movies have always been what we love on the side. And we both moderate a lot of cons, these conventions and whatnot. So the last few years we started doing a podcast, and we do a video version of it as well. And it's our pleasure to have Paul Hirsch on today. And this book looks familiar. Do you know who the guy is on the front here?
I think I am until I look in the mirror.
Well, that's okay. You're looking, actually, when we were having technical difficulties, and we all three looked at each other after, and it was like, he looks very dapper. We like your jacket. And I can't help but notice there's something shiny. Let's see, that would be to your right on that shelf right there.
Yeah, that's my goodie.
Yeah. Yeah, I was wondering, so do you always keep it there? Where do you usually, do you have a in glass and you walk into the room and the light comes on?
And to our podcast listeners, we were talking about his Oscar.
Yeah.
It's on a shelf in my office. My office measures about 4 feet by 8.
Yeah. So getting started, the first question I have is, why a book now? And that's the first question, but I want to follow it up with a comment, and it's really a compliment. I just got it last week. I told you we've had this plan since June, and we've kept it quiet. We haven't told anybody because we wanted to make sure that we actually got to do it. Okay. And we were so excited when you said you would do it when the book came out. But I'm about 50, 60 pages in. I have a 2-year-old, so forgive me. I'm trying to read 20 pages when I can. And this is really well written.
Oh, well, thank you.
So we've had several people on who have written books. Most of them had great stories.
Uh-huh.
You have good stories, but this is really well written, sir.
Well, thank you. I'm not sure what you mean by that. I never considered myself a writer. And when I was a kid, I always gravitated more toward math than English. And when I went to college, I tried to avoid any courses that would involve me having to write papers, which is impossible, of course, but I tried to keep it to a minimum. So I never really considered myself much of a writer. And to tell you the truth, whenever I wrote something, I thought it sounded like a term paper. So when people say they like my writing, I go, okay, thank you. I didn't expect it, and I'm happy to hear it.
Well, take the compliment, because I've read several books from different editors, filmmakers. The other book that it was reminding me of, even though I actually think yours is slightly better. Are you familiar with this book and this gentleman?
Yes.
Yeah.
Ralph Rosenblum.
What did you say?
Ralph Rosenblum.
Uh-huh. Ralph Rosenbaum. So it's a great book on editing that a lot of people have talked about over the years, but I've got to be honest, I'm having a little bit more fun with your book, actually.
Well, so Ralph's book is a lot older than mine, so maybe the references aren't as familiar to you.
Well, I actually think you're just a good writer. Because he talks about Mel Brooks, and there's some great stories in that one as well, because he cut the producers, and among many other films that we won't probably get here about, because we're here to talk to you about it, your work, but he just isn't the writer you are. So what made you write the book?
Well, I was on location in Vancouver in the last year of the previous millennium.
Yeah.
And my wife, Jane, had stayed behind in LA. And it was the weekend, and I was bored. And I'd been telling these stories on the set with some success. And I thought to myself, I should write these stories down, because they're pretty good stories. And they're all true, of course. So that's what I did. I wrote one chapter. I wasn't going to write it chronologically. I thought, well, that's boring, And then as I started to write it, I found myself having to constantly backfill and explain, well, I had met him earlier years ago when I had done a picture called so-and-so. And I thought, this is ridiculously complicated. I'll just write it chronologically. And then when I was editing the book many years later, my agent said, well, there's an interesting thing about the book business. When you submit a book for acquisition at a publisher, they only read the first 50 pages. So I didn't know that. So the agent said, you have to get Carrie. Everyone knows Carrie. You have to get Carrie in the first 50 pages. So I looked at the book and I thought, well, that's going to cut out about how I got started in the business, which is the question I get asked the most. How did you get started?
Right.
What people usually find the most interesting. So my editor, a wonderful woman named Jenny Shute, suggested, why don't you start with Carrie, and then that way it'll be in the first 50 pages, of course. So that's what I did. And it worked out because I went from Carrie to Star Wars, which is the picture that everyone seems to be most interested in, now called A New Hope. I'm learning that it's now called A New Hope, but we always called it Star Wars. And since I went from Carrie to Star Wars, the chapter on Carrie, which is the first chapter in the book, ends with me going off to work on Star Wars, which is what everyone's most interested in. Mm-hmm. And I took what had been the first chapter, which was it was called Getting Started.
Yeah.
I retitled it 10 years earlier, and I circled back and I explained how I got to the point of going from Carrie to Star Wars.
What I find interesting about that, there's a couple of things, but the first is I love Carrie. I love Star Wars. If you looked behind the wall, there's a one sheet of Star Wars and Empire Strikes Back. They're both original. And of course, you cut both those pictures. But I would have thought that they would have wanted you to start, as much as people love Carrie, that they would have wanted you to start with Star Wars rather than Carrie.
They didn't. Yeah. Well, they didn't say that.
Yeah. No,
that wasn't the suggestion. I mean.
Yeah. Because I understand why.
I guess he was trying to observe the chronological
yeah.
flow as much as possible.
Right. I know that they probably wouldn't want you to start with Hi Mom and getting involved with Depalma, but I do. It's fascinating. So let's start from the beginning, if you don't mind. And you went to art school. Your father was a painter, right?
Yeah, I went to the High School of Music and Art.
Yeah.
Public high school in New York City, and you can major in either art or music. I was a music major, and I played the drums. I was a timpanist in the symphony orchestra there.
Wow.
And I entertained for about a day the notion of becoming a professional percussionist, and a very kind and wise and thoughtful teacher talked me out of it. She said, "You don't want to do that. You don't want to do that. Don't do that." So
you went to college and then studied?
Yeah, I went to Columbia.
Uh-huh.
Didn't know what I wanted to major in, and there was a teacher on campus whose courses everyone talked about. He was just a fabulous teacher, and great teachers can make any subject interesting.
Yes.
So this guy was a fabulous teacher, and he taught two courses, one in the fall on Italian Renaissance painting, and one in the spring on Northern Renaissance painting. And I took these courses and decided to become an art history major, not knowing what I wanted to do. I had a sense that because my father had been a painter and my mother had been a dancer as a young woman, that I wanted to do, my tendency was toward something in the arts in some way. And I actually applied to and was accepted at the Columbia School of Architecture.
Yeah.
But it turned out that was too dry for me. And I'd already gotten a bachelor's degree, and here I was starting a 4-year program for a second bachelor's degree. And it just seemed like too great a commitment to school. I was ready to go out into the world at that point. So I left. I didn't even tell them I was leaving. I just stopped going. To this day, I still get mail from the Alumni Association of the Architecture School. But
did they not know you didn't graduate?
Not only didn't I graduate, I didn't make it to midterms the first year. I left around this time in the first semester, and got a job. A friend of mine had been cutting a little documentary in his apartment on West End Avenue in New York, and I visited him. It was the first time that I ever saw a moviola. A moviola was a standard workhorse editing machine for film editors for 50 or 60 years, maybe 70 years. And when I saw it, it was in 1966. The videotape machine, the Betamax, had not been invented yet. And the only way you could see a moving image in those days was at the movies or on television.
Right.
There's no way to record video image at that time. So there was no such thing as pause. There was no such thing as fast forward. There was no such thing as rewind. But this moviola could do all of those. And, it just seemed like a fantastic, really neat piece of equipment. And he had a cutting room with splicers and synchronizers. And do you know what a synchronizer is?
A little bit. So we're probably a little more, probably slightly more familiar than some of the people that have been interviewing you. Yeah.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Let me see here. This is a synchronizer.
Mm-hmm.
And it was all kind of neat stuff like that they had around the house. And I was interested in, I liked working with my hands at the time, so I thought, I want to learn about this. So I got a job working for an industrial film company in New York called Dynamic Films, and they made stock car races, films of stock car races. And then they would tag on at the end of it a plug for STP or Firestone tires or spark plugs or whatever, and they would sell them to various companies for purposes of showing them at their sales conventions and so forth. And while I was working there delivering packages, I would take excuse me, I'd take cut work prints to the lab, to the negative cutter, and I'd pick up cut negative from the negative cutter, take it to the lab, and I'd pick up prints from the lab and bring them back to the company. And I did this for a couple of weeks, and the negative cutter that I was bringing stuff to told me he was looking for an assistant to train. So I asked one of the editors there, I said, is that a good idea? He said, well, you'd be handling film instead of packages. So I thought, well, okay. So after 2 weeks, I gave them 2 weeks notice. I went to work as a negative cutter. I learned the technical end of the business, how you prepare a negative for printing and all that. And then as soon as I stopped learning, it became very boring. And the guy I was working for was a screamer, so I quit.
Yeah.
I got a job as an assistant editor, even though I wasn't an assistant editor, but I got a job at a trailer house. They were doing trailers and television spots for MGM and United Artists. And after a while, they had more work than they could handle. They were expanding at that point, and they started they gave me a 10-minute film, a featurette it's called, The Making of a Film, about the Thomas Crown Affair.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Steve McQueen. And they wanted a 3.5-minute version of this 10-minute film, so I did that. And then they gave me one to do from scratch for Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. A client like that, and from then on, I was editing, and then I started doing trailers as well. That's how I got started.
So that's. Do you think? I'm assuming that this is a fairly redundant question, but you're not the first person who got into movies, or at least classically trained in maybe editing or at least directing, cutting their teeth on trailers. Filmmakers like Alan Arkush and Joe Dante cut trailers for Corman, I think, before they actually got their chance to direct, if I'm not mistaken. So how did that prepare you later? Did it just give you more of like these things as far as cutting to the point, or did it give you a training to make a movie flow better?
Well, trailers are its own thing, but what the thing about trailers is that it's all about rhythm.
Right.
Rhythm and pace. So, and showmanship too. So,
without giving too much away from the movie too.
Well, they don't care about that,
Oh, really? I mean, I've seen some trailers where they just.
I saw the trailer for Mission Impossible. I turned to Brian. I said, "Okay, well, they just gave away for free every great moment in the movie, and we're going to show boring crap in between."
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they're so desperate to get people in the seats, they'll show everything,
Right.
But trailers are rhythm, and then you pick up what your skills that you're learning as a trailer editor is how to do stuff with rhythm. It doesn't help you to look at dailies and figure out where to cut in and where to get out. I mean, because trailer editors are all working from cut material, so it's a different skill.
So what do you think about your personality attracted you to editing? I know you briefly said that you liked working with your hands.
Yeah.
Why not direct? Why not production design? Why not? Because your parents were artists. I know that you fell in love with film, and I've got to the part of the book of I've gotten past it, but your time in France and going to the great movie houses, because just so our audience knows, to reiterate what you said, there was no VHS tapes, there was no beta. If you either caught it on television or you saw it in the theater.
Yeah.
And the French revere film. And so you're able to watch a lot of classic films. I know you studied Orson Welles and a few others.
Yeah.
So what do you think about your personality attracts you to editing?
Well, I'm sort of introverted, and
so our friend Chad is too.
Yeah, you basically have my dream job. I've always wanted to be an editor. So because of the fact, the way I view editing is kind of, because when you said you started out in art and then went to architecture, I'm kind of hearing like it was basically leading you to editing, because each one you start with a blank canvas And that's kind of how I feel about editing. Is they give you you're given a bunch of video, and you have to do something with it to make art, which I've always found fascinating. That's that's why I've always loved editing. Also, I'm an introvert and just like being alone in a room putting something together to make it look nice.
So our failed short films have been directed by...
Sorry, I have to disagree with you.
Oh no! Why? Oh, please.
Because you're not starting with a blank canvas. You're starting with material that's given to you. So you're not creating the material that you're working with, like a writer or a painter facing a blank canvas, literally a blank canvas, or a blank page sitting down to work. Those are creative skills. Those are the creative arts. I would say that editing is more an interpretive art, like a violinist picking up a score by a composer and playing it. He's bringing his art to something that someone else has created.
Right,
Or a dancer who choreographs something to a piece of music that's already written. So I would say that, in my view, editing is an interpretive skill, or interpretive art, if you want, where you look at the material and then you interpret it through your own sensibility.
No, that makes perfect sense.
So that leads me to the question about authorship. You've talked about that you don't feel that you've had authorship over the films, but that you've had quite a bit of input. So
I do feel a sense of authorship, but I wouldn't call myself the author. At best, I'd say, in the best situations, I would say I co-authored the film with the director. Co-authored cut, I would say, not the film, but I co-authored the cut with the director.
Yeah. I'm sorry, James, I didn't interrupt you. Do you have a question?
No, go ahead.
Oh, okay.
I've got something.
So we talked a little bit about your time in Europe. There's one thing. How did you end up in a hippie commune in Eugene, Oregon? Was it a hippie commune?
I don't know that it merited that lofty name. It was just a bunch of lost people hanging out in a house.
It was in Eugene, Oregon, right?
Yeah, that was one of my lowest moments.
Oh, well, I don't mean to bring... Sorry, I just found it fascinating when I was reading your book.
Yeah. Well, when you're young and you don't know much, you try and go in different directions and try things and learn what's right for you and what's not right for you.
Yeah. Okay. So can you talk a little bit about your relationship? And I know you've been asked about this, I'm sure, ad nauseum, but I would like for you to talk a little bit about your relationship with Brian Depalma. Now, you've worked with several directors more than once, but nobody more than Depalma. Let me see how many times. Hold on. Is it 11 films, right?
11, yeah.
11 films. That's a multitude of pictures.
Yes. A lot of dailies.
So Chad and yeah, I bet. So the three of us are best friends, and even we argue, even on things like this and our ideas about what we want to do. How on earth have you maintained that, I'm assuming, friendship? I'm hoping a friendship on top of the professional relationships you had through 11 films, because I can imagine there's been some arguments through 11 movies.
Yeah, well, if when you read the book, you'll see that my last collaboration with Brian didn't end well, and there was an unfortunate hiatus in our relationship, but I'm happy to say that we reestablished a connection again, and things are on a better footing. He was he's kind enough to write a blurb for the book, and I don't think he's ever done that for anyone else.
Yeah, it's right there on the front, yeah.
And in the inside flyleaf as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I'll get there to the book eventually. I was just, how do you build those relationships, though? How do you how hard is it for you to maintain a little bit of your vision, but yet to eventually give up control sometimes because the director wants something different? Because I can imagine that sometimes that's maddening.
Well, that's a given at the outset. Film is a collaborative enterprise. And because you have a lot of different artistic people working on the film, actors, production designers, composers, editors, cinematographers, all these people have artistic skills and sensibilities. But in order to work together, the protocol is that there's one person in charge making the decisions, and that's the director. So
Right.
it's a given going in that you are going to be subject to being overruled. And my job is to come up with ideas, suggestions, make choices that are either endorsed or revised. And the invention of digital editing has taken a lot of the psychological pressure off the editor, because on film, in order to make a change, you had to destroy the previous version. You had to take it apart. You only had one work print.
Right.
So you couldn't save the version that you had, and that created a kind of tension between the director and the editor. So that's gone now. You can just hit a button and make a copy and save it for later. So yeah, I mean, I always tell people we're in the suggestion business. And that's my job, is to make suggestions, and it's part of the game. You try to make your suggestions, and sometimes the suggestion is the cut that I deliver is implicitly filled with suggestions.
Yeah.
So the game is to try to make it such that the director doesn't want to make any changes in it.
Right.
It's his choice, but it's my work.
Yeah.
So that's what I mean about co-authorship. To the degree that my choices are endorsed, that's an affirmation of my contribution to the film. Empire Strikes Back was locked 4 weeks after the end of principal photography.
Really?
Yeah.
4 weeks after.
Yeah.
That's impressive. I'm sorry, I haven't got to that part of the book yet. But can you talk a little bit about that, how it was so quick?
Well, it was supposed to shoot for 16 weeks and it shot 29.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There was time for, adjustments while we were getting to that point. And then after 4 weeks, we were done. So we lost 13 weeks out of the post schedule, but we made our dates anyway because we were able to lock the picture so quickly. And that's now to the script. That the script was so strong and not flawed, didn't have big problems in it that we had to solve in post.
Right. Well, I didn't know if that was because Lucas had a definitive vision, if Kirshner had a definitive vision, or they both had a definitive vision, and that was it. And you're saying it was because the script was so good.
And Larry Kasdan, had a script that everyone could work from. Of course, George had an input into it, of course,
Right. Lee Brackett wrote the first version, correct? And then Larry Kasdan wrote the filming version?
So I understand. Yeah.
What'd you say?
So I understand. The editor's not around for that part.
Oh, yes. Okay. Yeah.
One question I have, and just because you talk about, going to France, seeing the films, just as somebody that does this professionally, what movies would you recommend other than your own that people who are interested in seeing creative edits look at? What classics would you recommend, or what would you say should be films that people should watch?
Well, somebody asked me recently, "What's your favorite film?" And I thought, I find that hard to answer. But then I started listing in my mind what my favorite films are, and I thought, what's interesting about this list is that they're all black and white. Every one of them. I would start with Citizen Kane, because that was the one that really blew me away.
Yeah.
And sort of got me thinking about film as a career.
Yeah.
And then, in no particular order of preference, I would say La Strada by Federico Fellini, Nights of Cabiria by Federico Fellini, Sunset Boulevard, Billy Wilder.
Back in the day, they all had faces.
Yeah. And what else? Treasure of the Sierra Madre. I'm not sure. Those are the ones that come to mind off the top of my head.
So you say Treasure of a Sierra Madre maybe over the Maltese Falcon? I mean, when we start talking about John Huston,
yeah, I think Bogart's character in Treasure of the Sierra Madre is brilliant. That paranoia, you know, and
well, he's a real bastard.
And the story as it develops, and the just the characters in it, and the way the story is told, and the ironic ending, you know, just a great movie.
Yeah, I agree.
White Heat is another one.
Yeah. So you like Cagney?
Not always, you know.
Yeah. That's okay. I was just we're trying to delve into your mind to see what it is that influenced you the most.
Yeah, I'm always interested.
Red River, Howard Hawks.
Yeah.
A lot of great movies, and they all seem to be black and white. Yeah. And I understand that film students today don't like to watch black and white movies, which is a crime.
Yeah, I don't understand that at all.
Well, and we spoke to William Malone, who actually talked about his love of even silent film. And I talk to students. Like I said, I teach, and I actually do an activity where I talk about film, and it's amazing how many 23, 24, 25, and I don't mean to stereotype groups because there's exceptions, but even something from the 1970s, they're like, yeah, we've never seen that. And it blows my mind.
Well, there's actually a friend of ours who's a production designer who was fairly big, and he worked quite a bit he made a career for 30 years. And he actually, there's a lot of movies who were just in the 80s that he missed because he was working the whole time on other pictures.
Right.
And now that he's retired, we were talking the other day. I was like, it was one specific movie I'm not going to bring up here. I was like, how in the hell did you not see that? It was a huge hit in the 80s. Right. I don't know. I was working on a show. What show? I don't know.
Well, you know, one of my coevals was complaining that young people today don't know this or that or the other thing, and they're so ignorant, you know. And I said, well, I don't know any of the singers coming up. I don't know any of these apps that are on, you know. So I think we're all equally ignorant, only about different things.
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
that's probably very accurate. I do, however, think film school students should watch some black and white films, and they probably should watch some European films as well. But we are not going to argue that point here. Can you talk a little bit about the third act of Carrie? Because that's what people remember, and it is, of course, a cutting marvel. And it's interesting in the book because it was originally all split screen. That's what Brian wanted.
Yes, he filmed the prom to be cut in split screen from the moment that Carrie starts attacking the crowd,
yeah,
to her exit from the gym.
Yeah,
and it didn't play well in split screen, and there was too much resistance to it. So Brian said, just, you know, what he had done when he shot the split screen sequence, he had neglected to protect half the frame because he knew he was planning to use it only for the left side, let's say. Mm-hmm. So you might have a light stand and a crew member standing in the right side of frame, and so that was usable only as a split screen element. But there were other shots where he protected the whole frame, and I went through and used as many of the full screen shots as I could, and kept the split screen only where I was forced to by circumstance.
Yeah,
and I think the mix is kind of pleasing the way it is now. The thing about split screen is that it's appealing intellectually, but it distances you emotionally. So you're sort of reminded that you're outside the experience and watching it. So it's interesting, but in terms of empathizing with what's going on, it's a little bit of a distancing device.
Yeah. So in other words, you're saying it takes you out of the movie somewhat.
Yeah, even unconsciously, you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I had that issue. It's funny you mentioned that, and then you mentioned earlier about working for the trailer for Thomas Crown Affair, because that's one of the issues I have with the original Thomas Crown Affair is the fact that it constantly switches to those sometimes.
It's Norman Jewison, right? It's Norman Jewison, correct?
Yeah. Pablo Ferro was the guy who designed all the panels. They used to call them panels.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's still a great piece of film. It's just sometimes when it was cutting like that, I had a hard time. I'm like, where does my attention need to go?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So we talked a little bit about Carrie. Do you want to mention or give us a little story about meeting Depalma?
Well, I met him through my brother Charles, who had a job at Universal Pictures in New York, whose job it was to scout writing and directing talent in New York City. But I think he was actually there to be a lightning rod to deflect fund seekers from disturbing the real executives. They would, somebody would come and want money from the studio to do a film. They'd say, "Well, talk to Hirsch there, talk to him."
Yeah.
One of the people who came to him was Brian Depalma, and he proposed to the studio that they finance one of his projects, and they refused. So he and Brian decided that on Charles's 2-week vacation, they would shoot a low-budget movie. My brother raised the money from family, friends. I think it was something like $36,000, which adjusted for inflation is about, I don't know, it's still probably under 100,000, but low budget. And the picture sort of caught on. It's called Greetings, which is the opening salutation in letters from the draft board. It's like the service system would send out letters to 18-year-olds, and it would say, "Greetings." And you knew right away what the letter was. You are to report to your local draft board. And it was during the Vietnam War in 1968, and a story of 3 young guys who were trying not to be shipped off to Vietnam.
Right.
So, because I was cutting trailers at the time, they needed a trailer for it. I cut the trailer. I met Brian that way. He and I hit it off. The picture was somewhat of a success. They got the money to do a sequel, originally intended to be called Son of Greetings. I was 23 years old, and I thought, yeah, I can do that. I can cut a feature. I didn't know anything about it. I didn't know what I didn't know. It was confidence born out of ignorance.
Which is sometimes a wonderful thing.
I guess. I mean,
yeah.
Or swim, So I made a big mistake that a rookie mistake that I've seen repeated, which is to think that if you edit each part of the movie perfectly, then the movie will be perfect. That's not the case.
Yeah.
So it was an important lesson to learn, and it's important to look at the whole movie before you decide to invite the producer to see it.
Yeah, you talk about the screening in the book a little bit, and it was not an overly successful film, right? It was. They were in a huge theater for the first screening, or?
Yeah, they opened it on a big, I think they opened the theater where Ben-Hur had played a few years earlier. 30 people in the audience, and they all had worked on the movie.
Well, we've been there for our short films, right? There's a couple that there's only 4 or 5 of us, so at least you had 30 people. Moving along, I know that you've been probably just bombarded with Star Wars questions, but there's a couple of things I want to ask about it specifically, and I haven't read this part of the book, so forgive me. I do know a little bit about the cut wasn't working originally, correct?
Right.
The cutting, and Lucas wasn't happy with it. It wasn't his vision. So you were brought in after, because I know you wanted to work for Lucas, and you told your wife that you wanted to do it. You were a fan of American Graffiti, correct? And you met him through Depalma?
Yeah, I met George after Graffiti. Yes. And, yeah. And he was planning Star Wars at the time.
Yeah, but he'd already hired an editor?
Yes.
Yeah. So can you talk a little bit about that story, how the cut wasn't working and you were brought in?
Well, George was shooting in the UK, and he had hired a British editor, very good editor, who had a number of very successful films to his credit. And for some reason, he just didn't get Star Wars. He didn't like it or just didn't get it. And when George saw what he had done at the end of principal photography, he decided not to keep him on the picture. And he asked his wife, Marcia, who had worked on American Graffiti, and she'd cut Taxi Driver and Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore for Scorsese. And he asked her to come on the picture. And he had already hired a San Francisco editor named Richard Chu, who had worked on The Conversation and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And they came through New York on their way back from the UK, and we screened Carrie for them. And they went on to California, and I got a call a couple of weeks later from Marcia saying, can you come help us work on Star Wars? Because we're not going to be able to meet our schedule, just the two of us. So I said, you know, the story it's a good story, and it's in the book.
Yeah, I know you were a fan. You didn't quite understand, you know, I mean, what the hell's a Wookiee, right? When you're reading the script.
Yeah.
It was the art that attracted you to it, correct?
Well, I'd seen some production stills.
Yeah.
So the look of it was, you know, I saw stormtroopers, I saw droids, I saw the Sandcrawler, I saw Jawas, saw the Wookiee. You know, I thought, okay, I'm in. I don't know what it is, but I'm in. You know.
James, what's the great quote about him winning the Oscar? What is it? You were too young to know that you wanted.
I won an Oscar before I planned to win an Oscar, or something like that. I read a quote that was attributed to you about your early onset Oscar winning.
Yeah, I mean, I won the Oscar before I even, you know, thought about maybe someday winning one. You know,
right.
I was just hoping to get another job.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I hadn't developed the desire for one yet. I mean, you know, it's always a dream in the back of your mind. But when I finished Star Wars and came back to New York, Star Wars was the first picture I worked on that wasn't for Brian. So I came back to New York and I saw Brian, and the first thing he said to me was, "You're going to win the Oscar." And that was the first I thought of it. You know, I thought, he said, "Oh yeah," he says, "You're going to win the Oscar for this."
So is it because he saw the picture?
Yeah, he'd seen it.
And he
saw the success it was having.
Yeah. So that's when the movie came out. He told you that. Okay.
Yeah.
So, well, the good thing about, I would imagine the one good thing about winning the Oscar is that you didn't have to worry about your next job. They came a calling.
It changed my whole life.
Yeah.
And, you know, as the father of a 2-year-old, you can appreciate winning the Oscar a year after my first child was born.
Yes.
What a stroke of luck that was.
Yeah. Because Christopher Walken, James, has said the same thing, right? The winning the Oscar for the Deer Hunter.
Yeah.
It bought him his house. That's what he said. The best thing about that Oscar was it paid for his house.
Yeah.
You know, he was in work from that point on.
Well, actors make a lot more money than editors.
Well, I hope that your Oscar did help raise that child. So, other than I've never been, I know it's a very cliched question and I apologize, but you are one of the few Oscar winners that we've talked to. Do you leave? Is it an out of body experience? Because isn't there a picture of you and Farrah Fawcett, right?
Yeah.
So do you just leave your body and you don't realize where you're at? What's it? Can you describe in any way, shape, or form how that feeling is? Well, or are you too young to really appreciate it?
A week earlier, I was at the Eddie Awards, which is an award given by the American Cinema Editors.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, the Eddie, I'd never heard of the Eddie before. You know, I thought Eddie's, you know, I'm not, and I'll be cool. You know, I'm cool. And got to the moment when they were saying, and the nominees are, my heart started to pound in my chest. And I thought I was having a heart attack. I mean, and fortunately we didn't win, because I don't know what I would have done if I had to get up and speak at that moment.
Out of curiosity, what beat you? Do you remember? What who won in that category?
Oh, it was The Turning Point. What's his name?
Well, it was for the movie The Turning Point.
I'm not familiar with
I'm
that
not familiar
film.
with that film.
Turning Point was directed by Herbert Ross and was nominated for 11 Oscars.
Oh wow!
11 Oscars, and it won 0.
So it looks like we got some homework.
I've got some homework to do, and rarely does anyone beat us with that, something that we should know. And I even have questions here about Herbert Ross, but I've never seen, because you worked with him 4 times, right?
Yes. Herbert was one of the most important directors in Hollywood. He directed movies that had the biggest stars.
Mm-hmm.
He directed a lot of films by Neil Simon, and he was the go-to studio director for the most prestigious projects.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I have actually never seen Turning Point.
Yeah. Now last time we got homework.
So did you have the same reaction when the Oscar happened?
Yeah. So when they were at the Oscars during the commercials, they would say, "Recipients, keep your speeches short and don't worry about the fact that 300 million people are watching you."
Because that's what you want to be reminded of right beforehand.
Especially
don't worry, there's only 300 million people. There's only 3 channels, and they're not, the 2 other channels don't even have new programming on tonight. They're running reruns because of this.
Well, I would imagine, I mean, because I'm not quite as introverted as Chad, but I'm introverted, and even when I teach before 30 students, I tell them I have to go to my office and I have to, give myself a pep talk. So I can't imagine if somebody looked at me and be like, "Okay, now there's 3 million. Don't get nervous." So that's amazing.
300 million.
300 million.
That would just be. I would have to have cue cards or something.
Anyway, but my heart started to pound, and I thought, I recognized this feeling. So it didn't take me by surprise.
Yeah.
And then, of course, because I expected the Turning Point to win again, but I was running, and I was nominated against Walter Murch for Julia and Michael Kahn for Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and people who went on to have extremely distinguished careers. Why can't I remember the name of the editor of The Turning Point? I'm going to have to look it up. But anyway, it'll come to me after I get off the line with you guys.
Well, that's okay. We're going to have to actually go watch Turning Point, because I thought I had seen, and we've seen the other movies, of course, Close Encounters and Julia, but that's stiff competition.
Let me ask you a question. Are you going to edit this?
We usually don't. We usually just put it out the way it is. Well, we can edit out if there's anything that you want us to remove.
I was going to tell you a story that involves an obscenity. So
you can obscene. You can say shit, damn, fuck, whatever you like. If you want to protect your image, that's okay. You can tell us afterwards.
Well, no, it's a good story. Herbert,
please.
Shirley MacLaine and Mel Brooks's wife,
Anne Bancroft, right?
Anne Bancroft. Yeah. So Anne Bancroft and Shirley MacLaine had been dancers together as young women.
Okay.
And one had stayed in the business, and one had left the business, and the scene they're going to stage was sort of a climactic scene where the 2 women have a fight. They fight each other. So Shirley calls Herbert over. She says, "I just want to talk to you a little bit, and I just want to make sure that I'm understanding the circumstance, the context of this moment." And so while they're talking, Anne Bancroft overhears this, and she comes over and she says, "Herbert, when you get finished explaining to this dumb cunt what we've been doing for the last 2 months, I'll be And then they shot the scene.
But was the Turning Point editor, was that William H. Reynolds?
Bill Reynolds, yes.
Okay. I double checked it, so I pulled it up on.
Thank you so much for that lovely story. I want to believe that Bonehead Weekly is the only people that have gotten that story out of you as you're doing your press junkets for your book.
It's true. I have never told that story.
Oh, good.
That's amazing.
Thank you. Feel free to drop all of those that you would like. We love hearing those. But that makes sense because Anne Bank, she had to have a strong personality to deal with Mel Brooks for 30, 40 years.
Yeah.
Go ahead, James.
And jumping around a little bit, because if I don't ask questions about one film that you edited, I'll get in trouble when I go home tonight, because it's a favorite film of my wife, and as we're talking about getting to talk to you, I said Star Wars and all that stuff.
Hold on, he's going to guess.
Ferris. No.
Still Magnolias.
Oh. Okay.
And so what?
That's right. You're from the South.
And exactly, it's got Dolly in it. So I mean, my wife grew up in Western Kentucky, and so she actually went to places like Dollywood, and
which is directed by Herbert Ross, by the way. Just
but so talking about that, I'm actually curious because you edited films, that you have Star Wars, space, fantasy, epic, all of that. You do have Ferris Bueller's Day Off, which is. I think has shown.
And we have some John Hughes questions in a minute, but keep going, James.
But then you also have Steel Magnolias and Footloose. What is, just from an editing viewpoint, and you mentioned music earlier, there's kind of a beat to it. What is the difference between a beat for kind of a drama versus science fiction versus Carrie horror? How do you approach that as a director? Is it like a difference in a musical beat?
Yeah, finding the rhythm of each individual picture.
Well, like I said, editing is sort of an interpretive art. So it's as if you're a dancer and you listen to the music and you say, well, how does this make me want to move? Is it slow? Yeah. Is it fast? Is it exciting? Is it sad? Is it, So how you respond to the material is dictated by the material and your own sensibility.
Yeah.
I mean, all you really have to rely on as an editor is your instinct, and if you follow your instincts and you have good instincts, then you'll do well.
Well, I want to say, and this is being married to someone that loves Steel Magnolias. I've seen it several times. Yeah. The editing that was done between the two old ladies, their rivalry and I guess humorous bitterness.
Shirley MacLaine and Olympia Dukakis.
Yeah, right? Is I'll be honest, as somebody that's not as near and dear a fan as my wife is, there's something about the way that's shot, cut, whatever, that I enjoy those scenes more than I probably should. So thank you for making that film even fun for me.
Yeah, well, it was fun to work on. I met Dolly. The interesting thing about Dolly is that she has these, giant wigs and the false eyelashes and very theatrical makeup and very theatrical clothing. And she's the most genuine person I've ever met in my life.
All of the people, she's the most genuine person you've ever met. Not in Hollywood, but ever.
She's among, I wouldn't say the most genuine, but what's fascinating about her is because she has such an artificial facade, but it seems to vanish when you talk to her. That she's just a very genuine person. It's striking because the other genuine people sort of look like me or you or whatever, but she comes across as a real person, even despite the showbiz exterior,
Right. Can we? I know we could sit here and talk about certain movies all day, and I know you've been bombarded, but can we talk a little bit about John Hughes and your connection and how you got to meet him?
Yeah.
How you got to work with those movies? I know you get hit with Ferris, but the three of us. Well, honestly, my favorite John Hughes film is Planes, Trains, and Automobiles.
Well, it's almost Thanksgiving, so that's appropriate we talk about it.
Yeah, I know. I wanted to talk about it, and I was so excited because we're 2 days away, and it really is the best Thanksgiving movie ever made.
Well, we had a screening of it in Chicago last week. And it was the first time I'd seen it in 32 years.
Really? You haven't seen it that long? Because I think you posted about it. I saw it on your Facebook. You posted about it, I think, because you've done several signings lately. So, what were your thoughts after watching it, and since you hadn't seen it in 32 years? Because obviously you saw all the footage, you've seen everything, and you were with it day in and day out for so long. But 32 years later to watch it.
Well, it was great because, usually when you get to the end of a picture, you can't stand to watch it even one more time. You've seen it so many times, you just feel like you'd rather put your eyes out than see it again, So when the picture was finally done and playing in theaters and people were laughing at it, I couldn't be there. It was impossible. So I never got the pleasure of seeing it play in front of a crowd.
Yeah.
Except when we were in previews, which is a different experience altogether. But this was the first time that I saw the finished film with an audience, and we sold out the theater in Chicago, and it played great, and the laughs were huge, and it was just so rewarding and fun. I forgot how funny that movie is. There were so many things in it that I'd sort of forgotten by now, and it was just an absolute joy, one of the most exciting screenings of my career.
That's fantastic. I love hearing that. Can you talk about your relationship with John Hughes and working with him and how that came about?
Well, John had worked with a legendary editor named Dee Allen, who was from New York, and he had such a successful collaboration with her that he decided he wanted to work only with New York editors. So it was between me and Jerry Greenberg. Jerry Cut, the French Connection, was the first New York editor ever to win an Oscar. But he was still living in New York, and I had moved to LA. So when the studio found out that Jerry would want, a per diem to be out in LA, he said, you have to hire somebody locally. And fortunately, I was living in LA at the time. I had moved there a couple of years earlier, and I met John, and that was it.
Okay. So can you talk about, I think that there was a lot of footage that wasn't used for Ferris and a lot of footage that wasn't used for Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. It's true that he shot a lot, correct?
Yes. I was just reading the other day that the script for Planes, Trains, and Automobiles ran 145 pages. And the rule of thumb in scripts is that a page is about a minute. It's actually it usually works out to be a little longer than that. So when Steve Martin read the script, he said to John, well, so, it's great. What are you planning to cut? And John looked at him like, cut?
Yeah.
What do you mean?
Yeah.
So John would not cut his scripts. And he would not rewrite them. And he wouldn't let anyone else rewrite them. So he shot this very long script. And then he had John Candy and Steve Martin, and he would encourage them to ad lib.
Yeah.
So the first cut of the picture ran 3 hours and 45 minutes.
Yeah, I've heard that.
We did and I don't expect you to go back and watch it or listen to it, but we did a whole 2 hours on John Hughes, actually, because we're huge fans. So I think we talked a little bit about the first cut.
Well, and because John Hughes, and correct me if I'm wrong, he was notorious anyway for just shooting like nonstop, like shooting everything over and over again. Like I imagine that had to have been quite a bit of work for you.
Yeah, well, it shot for 85 days.
Yeah.
The picture's 93 minutes. And we started out at 3:45, so we took out twice as much as we left in.
Yeah.
What was that process? Because he was notorious for wanting his own way. How was he to work with?
He was great until he wasn't. What happened was we were working under extreme pressure. I compared it to laying track in front of a locomotive. And it was a very pressure-filled situation, and it didn't end well in terms of him and me, but we got over it eventually, and it was just a very difficult, we were working around the clock. We went into previews around Labor Day, and we were booked into 4,000 theaters or something November 9th. So we needed the month of October for mixing, so we had September to lock the picture. We were at 2 hours, and the first screening, people started walking out, and we were blindsided by this. We just, what the heck, you know?
Yeah.
We screened the picture again later that week, and then again the following week, and then again middle of the following week, and we screened the picture 9 times in September, trying to figure out what the problems were, and reading the cards and trying to understand what people were having a problem with. And we finally solved it, but it was not difficult. I mean, it was not an easy or pleasant process.
Can you tell us a little about what the problem was? Do you remember?
Well, it took us 4 screenings to figure out that one of the things, see, getting down from 3 hours and 45 minutes to an hour and a half, or to 2 hours as we first did, you know, you take out an hour and 45 minutes, you think you're there. But when you start out so long, you cut and you cut and you cut, and you think you're done, but you're not. You know, so one of the things that we had taken out in trying to get the picture down was a subplot about money, who was going to pay for what, and so forth. And there was one moment at the train station where Candy offers to reimburse Steve for the train ticket. He says, "Give me your address, I'll send you the money." Steve doesn't want to have anything to do with this guy, and he says, "No, that's okay. You know,
All right.
the train ticket's a gift." You know, so we had taken that out, and the audience started to perceive Candy's character as a user. He was taking advantage of Steve. And they turned on him. They didn't like him because of that, and then they turned on Steve for, why is he staying with this guy who's taking advantage of him? And they just gave up on both characters. So we put that line back, and it just turned it around 180 degrees.
Wow.
Just that one little thing right there at the train station. I know exactly what you're talking about. Just that one little thing changed the whole picture.
Yeah. But then we had other problems at the ending, where the end was problematic, and we had to rewrite the end in the cutting. And again, it takes some time to explain that, but it's in the book, you'll see.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, I understand. Now, we do want people to read your book. Sorry about that.
Can I ask one thing about working with Hughes?
Sure.
So you worked on Planes, Trains, and Automobiles with Hughes, which he directed.
Yes.
But then you also did Dutch.
Right.
Which is a film that we find underappreciated.
I think it's an underappreciated class. And I'm going to hopefully have a question as we progress before we run out of time about another underappreciated film that you worked on.
We've been talking an hour. I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, if we need to start wrapping it up, we can. But keep going, Chad.
No. So was there any?
So how are you going to wrap it up?
Okay.
But no, was there any? How was working with Hughes when a film that he didn't direct but he did write? I mean, did he have any? Was he in the room working on Dutch as well, even though he wasn't the director?
No. We were in LA, and John was in Chicago at that time.
Oh, okay.
We did fly to Chicago for a preview, and he was seeing cuts and he was giving notes.
Gotcha.
Okay. All right. Do you want to? So we're going to ask about a couple more and then let him go.
Sure.
What is it? What was the one you want to ask about?
In terms of because you mentioned about timing and flow.
Yeah.
One movie I think you edited that in terms of timing I think is perfect and it's underappreciated is the movie Falling Down. Because that movie has everything from very slow moments to scenes that are just blow you out of your chair.
Uh-huh.
And I just wanted to talk to you about the process of editing that movie, if you have any stories about it as well.
And then working with Joel Schumacher, yeah.
Yes, Joel Schumacher.
Joel's a character. He's gay. He's openly gay.
Right.
He likes to, or at least he used to like to say things to make straight people feel uncomfortable. He's kind of mischievous that way. We were at the mix one day, and Chuck Campbell, who's an older man, was doing the sound on the film, and Joel was on the phone, and Chuck got his attention. He says, Joel, could you just listen to the Foley? Just tell me if you think this is too loud. And Joel said, he says, Chuck, I didn't get into the movie business to listen to Foley. I got into the movie business for the sunglasses and the blowjobs. So Joe was a real character, but he was also very gifted. And I think what's interesting about Falling Down is it has the distinction of being the film that had the fewest dailies of any picture I ever worked on.
Oh, really?
He would shoot minimally and always covered himself. And it was quite remarkable. It was like a blindfolded Zen archer hitting the bullseye every day, you know. I couldn't get over it. I said, well, why do you print so little? And he said, because I find dailies so boring.
That's wonderful.
That makes sense. James, did you have any other questions you want to ask for me?
No, I've really appreciated it. This has been phenomenal. So thank you.
Yeah,
This is not going out on the radio.
Well, it will. We do an audio version and a video version. But what I wanted to say is that we could have talked to you for 2 hours, and I understand you got to go. So, where can they find your book?
Hopefully,
I know where I got it.
There's still bookstores everywhere, but maybe not. You can order it on Amazon, on Barnes and Noble website, and on the website of the Chicago Review Press, which is the name of the publisher.
Yes. And again, the name of that book is A Long Time Ago in a Cutting Room Far, Far Away.
Yeah. So, what upcoming appearances do you have that you'd like to tell our audience about? Anything? Well, probably not close to Kentucky, but anything on the East Coast?
I'm actually going to the School of the Arts in the University of North Carolina in December.
Good.
Spend a couple of days there with the students. The man who's the head of the editing track there is somebody who worked for me a long time ago, Michael Miller. He has a very distinguished editing career himself. He worked with the Coen brothers a long time ago, and I'm going to see Michael for a couple of days, and then I have some events coming up in LA. I'm going to be at the Egyptian Theater. They're going to show a double bill of Sisters and Blowout. I'm going to sign some books and do a Q&A. And there's a couple of conventions in LA I'm going to be attending on a panel. One is called LosCon, which is this Friday. And then there's an Empire Con on December 7th, I believe it is. And I will be planning a trip to New York at some point in the spring. It hasn't been set yet. It's very interesting being on Facebook and promoting the book on Facebook. And I don't know what authors, how they managed before Facebook, because I've been getting a lot of feedback from people, readers and so forth. And it's really terrific. And I imagine that for authors before Facebook, you put your book out there and it would be like throwing a bottle into the ocean, sort of hoping that it would reach some distant shore and maybe somebody will get back to you about it. But I'm getting a lot of instant feedback, which is very nice.
It's amazing.
I met you guys.
Well, we're sorry.
Well, and I do want to say, I mentioned my wife loving your films, and obviously they've had an impact on me. So as movie fans, and I'm sure you hear this from a lot of movie fans, but thank you for having a huge impact on what I've watched and what I view as important, and thank you for that.
Yeah, if nothing else,
gratifying to hear that.
Yeah, if you hadn't just given us Empire and Star Wars and Planes, Trains, but I mean, you gave us Phantom of the Paradise. I mean, I could just go on. So thank you so much for everything. Maybe one day I can ask you a Dylan Dog question. So
go ahead.
Well, it's not one of our favorite movies, so we're always kind of curious.
Really, why?
In there. Well, but see, that question sounds very negative, sir, and I don't want to. Once again, so our backgrounds are in broadcasting, but we all work in higher ed. What we always tell people is, blaming the screenwriter about a movie sucking sometimes is about the same as saying, that Foley or the second or the first or the grip screwed up that movie. There's many cooks in the kitchen. So what happened on Dylan?
The writer has a lot more to do with it than the grip.
Yeah, but you know what I mean. It depends. There's a lot of people who have a lot of input. So
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about Dylan Dog and the experience? Do you have a minute? If you want to, go ahead.
2009.
Yeah.
Economy had collapsed. I had to work on something.
Well, that's because I'm a big comic book nerd, and it's based on a long-running Italian comic book, and I enjoy that comic because it has the spirit of Groucho Marx and things like that. And then I saw the film, and I was like, I think they missed.
They never read that comic.
They missed a mark or two. They got Brandon and Ralph good, but yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, that's a short story. That's a good way to end it. Thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. This has been Bonehead Weekly. Please go out and buy Mr. Hirsch's book. A long time ago in a cutting room far, far away. Like I said, I bought my copy. I'm about 70 pages into it. I plan on finishing hopefully over the next few days on my Thanksgiving break. Sir, it's been a real pleasure to have someone of your caliber on the show.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. If I'm ever in Lexington, I'll look you up.
Uh-huh.